Do you like obscure Japanese 2D fighting games from the 90s? Well, you're in luck because Breakers and its pseudo-sequel, Breakers Revenge, are some of the more obscure titles from the Neo Geo's library. Breakers originally came out for the Neo Geo MVS in 1996 and the sequel came out in 98. The original got a home port for the AES and the Neo Geo CD in 97, but the sequel never left the arcade, and neither was released outside of Japan until recently. The Breakers collection contains both the Breakers games and is not only the first time that either game has had a mainstream release in the West, but it's also the first time that Breakers Revenge has been released on another platform other than the Neo Geo. Now, there was a port of the first game for the Dreamcast in 2017, which apparently isn't great, and there was also a cartridge produced for the AES of Breakers Revenge in 2020. Obviously not releases that were super accessible to anyone but avid retro gamers, and unsurprisingly, both games have remained largely unknown in the West. Despite this obscurity, a pretty dedicated competitive scene has grown up around the games over the years, even attracting well-known players like Justin Wong, and I guess that's one of the reasons why this collection exists. If I'm honest, I'm not entirely sure who it's for, but I'm glad it does exist because these are some truly hidden gems. Now, I need to clarify something before I go on any further. Breakers and Breakers Revenge are essentially the same game. Breakers Revenge has one extra character and a few minor visual changes here and there, but otherwise it looks and plays almost exactly the same. I think this probably could have just been a re-release of Breakers Revenge and no one would have complained. I'm assuming they included both games because why not? Okay, so on the surface this looks like your run-of-the-mill 2D fighting game. It's a typical 1v1 setup, you've got a health bar, a super meter, you've got special moves, and you've got super moves. The roster is pretty small and the cast of characters mostly look like rip-offs from more popular franchises. What separates it from other fighters is just how bloody fast it plays and how flexible the combo system is. Each character doesn't have an extensive moves list, but the number of ways that you can cancel and chain moves together gives it a huge amount of depth. Just about everything can be cancelled into something else, including dashes, and the timing of links is pretty loose. This makes the combo system extremely easy to pick up. To prevent matches from descending into obnoxious, inescapable combos and infinites is the game's signature mechanic, the breaker system. This allows you to interrupt an opponent's attack mid-combo. Understanding what block strings can be interrupted and what moves can interrupt requires a fair amount of character knowledge and some cat-like reflexes. It does have a reasonably low bar for entry, like anyone who's played a fighting game in the last 30 years will be familiar with the inputs to pull off special moves, although beyond the fundamentals, the skill ceiling is quite high. None of the more complex systems like the Breaker system are explained either, and this makes it a challenging game to master. It should come as no surprise then that this is also not an easy game. The default difficulty setting is absolutely brutal. The first time I sat down to play the arcade mode, I only got 3 characters deep before I got completely wrecked. Oh, and the final boss has to be one of the cheapest motherfuckers in any fighting game I've experienced. He's absurdly fast, he can teleport, he can punish supers with ease, and he can take half your life bar off with one combo. He's amazing. What stands out when playing it is just how buttery smooth it feels. The controls are incredibly responsive, attacks feel snappy and precise, and there's zero slowdown during the action. Like I said, the cast of characters is small, but they're diverse. Each character feels unique, and discovering each one is entertaining to the point where I haven't decided who I like best yet. Now, I've read a few reviews that compare the visuals and gameplay to fighting games on the Super Nintendo, and I couldn't disagree more. Sure, the visual design does come damn close to plagiarism in some instances, and watching gameplay on a phone might give you the impression that this is a generic 16-bit fighting game. The SNES could never hope to run this though, and you only need to play a couple of rounds to see why. I mean, just look at the Samurai Showdown port for the Super Nintendo compared to the original. The number of visual and performance compromises that had to be made for it to run on Nintendo's machine is huge, and this is considered to be a good port. Breakers is also so much faster than Sam Show. There's no way you could port it to something like the Super Nintendo and preserve the gameplay. Even the Dreamcast can't run it at a solid 60 frames per second. And yeah, that's partly due to it being emulation, but still, the Dreamcast is a shitload more powerful than the Super Nintendo. Anyway, I digress. My point is that this might look like a generic 90s 2D fighter, although playing it is anything but. So let's talk about content, because that's where this collection is a little light compared to others. Sure, you technically get 2 games, but like I said, they're basically the same. Both games have an arcade mode, a versus mode, and a team battle mode, which is a similar setup to the early KOF games where you pick a team. Revenge has a bunch of new stuff, and this is clearly the focus of the collection. Firstly, there's a training mode with all the features you'd expect, such as being able to toggle things like input display, damage stats, and hitboxes. There's online multiplayer that uses rollback netcode and is crossplay between everything. Online can actually be accessed from the main menu, although it's simply a shortcut to the multiplayer for Breakers Revenge. The original Breakers doesn't have any online. In the online options menu, there's a decent number of things to toggle, such as what region you're in, who you want to crossplay with, and what kind of connection you prefer. In my experience, the pool of people playing this is small, and although I've managed a few matches, rollback doesn't exactly mitigate a 200 millisecond ping. If you prefer high scores to getting your ass whooped, there are online leaderboards too. Additionally, this collection includes a gallery with various things to unlock, like concept art, fan art, and more. It's nowhere near as content-rich as something like the Capcom Fighting Collection or the Samurai Showdown Collection, and more would have been better, but what's here is still interesting. You might have noticed by now that this game is beautifully animated, with large detailed sprites and colourful backgrounds. The entire game has been translated too. Not that Japanese fighting games of this era needed much translation, but yeah, everything here has been presented in English. I would have liked to have the option to switch between the translated and Japanese versions just to get the full authentic experience, but it's a minor gripe. The UI for this collection is pretty basic, but it's fast and getting to where you want is easy. There are no load times when firing up either game, and there are also no load times in between rounds and matches. All the modern conveniences are here too, like moves lists in the pause menu, and there are various display options including a smooth and CRT filter. The audio is about the only area that's underwhelming. Stage music is fine, it uses the CD audio, but some of the effects and voice samples, oof. I feel like this is starting to split hairs though. Breakers Revenge is 25 years old this year. It's easy to understand why Breakers and its sequel didn't make much of a splash back in the day. By 1996, the fighting game genre was oversaturated, and 3D fighters were becoming increasingly popular. Street Fighter EX, for example, had come out just a couple of weeks earlier, and the gaming press very much favoured polygons over pixels at that point in time. Breakers was also released towards the tail end of the Neo Geo's life, and even in its prime, it's not like the Neo Geo was ever a mainstream platform in the console market. I have to admit that my expectations for this were pretty low. I actually pre-ordered it from Strictly Limited Games in a freak wine-related incident, and at the time I remember having some serious buyer's remorse. Having spent many hours peeling back the layers of its combat, I now have zero regrets. I'll pay that it isn't the most original looking 2D fighter I've ever played, but I think that time has allowed its unique gameplay to shine. It borrows from many other games and somehow still feels fresh. It plays more like a modern retro game than an actual retro game, and I can see myself returning to it frequently. It's not as rammed full of content as other collections, and calling it a collection at all is kind of stretching the truth, but for the price it's hard to argue with what the Breakers collection does contain. Whether you're a fan from way back or just curious to see if this is the real deal, there's never been a better time to jump into Breakers.